So let me start where a few of the questions to Brian has actually left off, because as I was listening to them, a few things I think are important to clarify, also in relation to the broader context of NAMA. One of the last questions that Brian got was about, why can't we let the banks fail? Now, ideologically, I would love to see the banks fail. I mean, I have no problem with that. I'm arch capitalist. I believe that the market should be allowed to run through its course, and whatever creative destruction it will wreak, so be it. The heavier the destruction, usually the greater the opportunity in the future as well. But the reason why we cannot do it is when you look at the balance sheets of the Irish banks, what the Irish banks have engaged over the number of years at is reckless lending. It wasn't the reckless lending done because they were collecting high wages, their executives were collecting high wages. That's a secondary effect. They were doing reckless lending because we never really had a proper conservative banking system in this country ever before. So as a result of it, what we saddled right now is across the entire banking sector is 173% ratio of loans to deposits. In other words, our own deposits cannot fund our own loans. That's for the 6 entire institutions. Now, the situation is not improving despite whatever the government is saying, because a year ago it was 155% ratio. Whereas bad as HBOS. In fact, actually one of our players, Irish Life and Permanent, has 300% loans to deposits ratios. So if you let them fail, or if you force them to take the write-downs currently, any write-down over, say, greater than 50%, would in effect sink the depositors. And that is the problem in the banking sector right now. Now, Brian also mentioned a few costs in terms of what it would take in terms of recapitalizing the banks. If we were to just take the money right now, put the money into the banks and say, now how much do you need to repair all of your balance sheets? And if we do that with a swap for the equity, in other words, we buy equity with this money, what we will need is about 22 billion. That's ex-Anglo. Anglo alone is about 10 billion. But if you take Anglo out, because it's already nationalized, it's about 22 billion pot. This is vastly less than NAMA is proposing in itself. Now, once again, I have no problem with ideology, and I don't like state ownership. But I'm forced to advocate the state ownership in this case simply by the fact that there is no market system which would allow the immorality of so-called people who have not made these erroneous decisions to pay for the system and bail out the shareholders of the banks and the bondholders of the banks. The capital structure of the banks is clear around the world. It's a capitalist capital structure, if you want, which I support fully, in which first the shareholder takes the hit, then the unsecured bondholders take the hit, then senior bondholders take the hit, and only then the taxpayer comes in with the rescue. Now, for the stupidity of our government, and this is stupidity, and I go on the record with that always, we have issued a blanket guarantee for the banks, and as a result of it, we boxed ourselves into the corner, whereby a default of the banks has now become a default of the state. Now, I'm for radical solutions. Lift the guarantee on all bondholders, including senior bondholders. Let them take the hit first, then we can send in the regular families to rescue the banks. Now, why I have a problem with NAMA legislation? Brian voiced some of the concerns that I would have, and I would share all of his concerns as well. These are technical concerns from my point of view. I see much more fundamental problems with the legislation as it is proposed right now. First of all, there is a payer envisioned in legislation, and that's the taxpayer. Ordinary people, ordinary families of this country are supposed to effectively give the money to the banks. Yet that payer is not even mentioned in legislation, with the exception of 2 instances in which case that payer, the taxpayer, is mentioned as the giver of the money. No protection is afforded to them. There is not even a veiled assumption, not even a veiled statement which would clearly identify the state as acting in the interest of the taxpayer. The state under the NAMA legislation is an entity of its own which operates on its own, uses our money to its own potentially benefit. There is nowhere it says that the Minister for Finance is obliged to deliver anything to the taxpayer in the end of this, if you want, procedure. There is, in my view, the legislation itself fails in delivering on what it claims that it wants to deliver, such as restarting of credit cycle and restarting of economic growth. My view, my concern on that side, is shared by the European Central Bank. In its legal note issued last week, the ECB clearly states that NAMA might have a positive effect in credit markets and might have a positive effect in terms of restarting the economy. That's uncertainty, notice implied, very cautiously phrased in the ECB statement. What the ECB statement unequivocally states will happen is that the bank's shareholders will be bailed out. So NAMA legislation by ECB own legal department analysis guarantees the solution of the problem from the point of view of the the shareholders and bondholders, but does not guarantee the solution of the problem from the economy point of view or from the point of the credit markets flows. Now, to me, this alone signals right away the red light in terms of any sort of the moral or ethical underpinning for NAMA, to begin with. What I mean by the problems about the economy, and wide economy, if you want. In my view, NAMA will result in zombie banks creation in this country. The banks, when they're recapitalized by NAMA, will have no incentive to go back to the market and start lending to anyone. Brian mentioned the demand. I completely agree with him. The demand is not there, and in many cases, the demand which we see right now, and a lot of small businesses which are clamoring for loans, are clamoring for those loans because they're so over-leveraged, they shouldn't exist in the first bloody place. They shouldn't have been lent years ago, and they should not be lent going forward. But that's a secondary issue. Supply of loans is not going to happen because the banks will have an incentive to use the money given from recapitalization. There will be only two incentives to the banks to use this money in two ways. The first one is to pay their short-term debts, which they will have to do. And the second one, keep the money in a stash as a capital reserve. Because if they don't do either one of those, the shareholders of those banks will be destroyed 2 months after NAMA gives them a check. And if the exercise of the bank is to protect the shareholders and the bondholders, well, why would they destroy themselves with the money that we give them? And there is no compulsion we can impose onto the banks ex post NAMA. Saying, Brian Lenihan can't go to the banks and say, you remember 2 months ago we gave you that blank check, yes, for X amount, okay? Now you have to lend that X amount back into the economy. The banks will tell him to get lost, and they'll have the full power to do so. So I don't believe that the zombie banks are not going to happen. NAMA fails, in my view, from the economic point of view, as an entity which will restore any sort of credit flow within the economy. What's even worse, if you look at the latest Bloxham note, on page 7 of that note, there is a separate line which states that the bank lending conditions in Ireland have been very favorable. So in years to come, we will have to tighten them. In other words, even our stockbrokers, with all their desire to omit the truth or cover it up in some way, shape or form, speaking from the point of view of the bank shareholder, because that's whom they represent, of course, that's what they're trying to sell, and that's honest, that's fine, okay? They're saying that the paying customers of the banks will be skinned. They will be cleaned up by the banks in years to come. Through the higher charges on mortgages, through higher charges on paying loans, through forwarding the loans. We know that's happening with the businesses which are paying today. Good businesses, which are still performing, which are still functioning, paying their loans. They're being told by the banks to restructure their loans to forward the payments. They're being forced, squeezed out of liquidity themselves by the banks. That is going to accelerate after NAMA. NAMA is not going to repair it in any way, shape or form.